And a more detailed view inside of the renal pyramid. Okay, so here's the outer cortex. Here's that inner medulla. Okay, the whole thing is the pyramid. And inside we have these nephrons. All right, this right here is the glomerulus, a very important structure. Okay, you'll notice that we have the PCT and the DCT. All right, the PCT stands for the proximal convoluted tubule. And the DCT stands for the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so we have the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, proximal to what? The glomerulus. All right, inside of the glomerulus, you see all that red stuff, which is a bunch of capillaries, specialized capillaries. And as fluid is being pushed into the glomerulus, so here's our blood supply. Okay, so the red tubes are indicating blood getting pushed into the kidney and therefore into the glomerulus, which is the beginning phases of filtration. Okay, the glomerulus is the beginning phases of filtration. All right, you'll also notice that there's the afferent and the efferent arteriole. Okay, so here's the afferent, and here is the efferent. All right, afferent arteriole and efferent arteriole. Okay, the afferent arteriole carries blood into the glomerulus, which is a very important kidney function, so that the blood can be filtered and waste can be removed. Also, excess fluid can be removed. Okay, and then you have the efferent arteriole, and the afferent arteriole will carry filtered blood away from the glomerulus. Okay, so the key phrase there is filtered blood, carries filtered blood away from the glomerulus. Okay, they also, the afferent and efferent arterioles play a role in blood pressure regulation through resistance. Okay, so that's going to be a key word, is resistance. All right, so look at it this way. All right, you have the heart, which is a pump, and it's going to push fluid into the kidneys. Okay, it's going to push fluid into the kidneys. If the filter is all clogged up, or the holes that are part of the filter are too small, then it's going to be harder to push fluid into the kidneys. Okay, so but however, if the filter holes are open and big, then it's going to be easy to push fluid through those filtration membranes. Okay, so that's the resistance I'm talking about. If there's too much resistance, then blood pressure goes up. If there's little resistance, then blood pressure goes down. The pump doesn't have to work as hard. Okay, we have the proximal convoluted tubules, and one of the reasons for all the convolutions is to increase surface area, because this is also going to behave as a filter. Okay, we're going to look at that in a little bit. And the distal convoluted tubule also behaves as a filter. Okay, now the actual order is going to be as fluid is passing through the glomerulus, it will go through the proximal convoluted tubule and then the loop of Henle, also known as the nephron loop. Okay, now keep in mind this is fluid, and the arrow is the direction of travel. So the fluid will go through the loop of Henle, also known as the nephron loop, and then eventually the distal convoluted tubule. So the reason for the convolutions is to increase surface area to maximize the filtration or absorption of the good stuff and getting rid of the bad stuff. And then eventually it's going to go into the collecting duct. Okay, the collecting duct are eventually going to communicate with those renal calyces that we looked at earlier. The renal calyces taper into the renal pelvis, which then sends fluid down the ureter. Okay, you'll also notice that this is the cortex area of the kidney, and this is the medulla area of the kidney. So we do have some filtration units. Okay, so a nephron, some of them are located in the cortex, so that's a cortical nephron, and and only a little bit goes into the medullary area, and then other of the filtration parts will have the nephron loop go way into the medulla. Okay, so as far as location, some of these filters are located mostly in the cortex, and some are located in part cortex and in the medulla. All right, that junction is called the cortico-medullary junction. So that's where the cortex and the medulla meet. So the cortico-medullary junction, which is right here. All right, on the loop of Henle, you'll notice that there are some blood vessels that communicate with the loop of Henle. Now, keep in mind there's fluid inside this nephron loop, and the body, this loop is going to give up some byproduct, so it has to go somewhere. Okay, so that's the reason for these blood vessels here. So it's going to eventually go into these blood vessels so that you can either keep it, so there's your reabsorption, or get rid of it, and there's your excretion. Okay, so that's some important facts to know. Reabsorption, keeping the good stuff. Excretion, getting rid of the bad stuff or the byproducts. Okay, each kidney has about 1.2 million nephrons. That's a lot of nephrons, and one of the ways in our society that people hurt their nephrons is by overconsumption of NSAIDs. Okay, NSAIDs stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. Okay, also known as ibuprofen, under brand names like Aleve and Advil. And although that medication does have a time and a place to help people with pain mitigation, the problem is the overconsumption of it. Okay, too much consumption, and you start to burn out those nephrons. Okay, you start to hurt the kidney. Okay, now there are other ways for people to hurt their nephrons that can lead to renal failure, but just know that the nephrons are very, very important, and once they are injured, that is an irreversible injury. Okay, you don't get that back. All right, the renal corpuscle is what's inside of it is that glomerulus. Okay, so going back to this picture right here, okay, you can see this outside part And the analogy would be like a baseball. Okay, a baseball has that outer leather skin. So there's the corpuscle or the outer part there. And if you peel back that leather, you see all the stringy stuff on the inside. And that would be the glomerulus there, the knot of capillaries. All right, the actual parts that the tiny little filter holes are the podocytes. Okay, and you can see the podocytes here. Okay, these those are all little slits. Okay, little holes that they're very tiny. Okay, you'll notice the size of a red blood cell and the size of these podocytes. And what that means is the red blood cells are too big to slip through the podocytes, which means if you find blood in the urine, that's not a good thing, okay? Because the red blood cells are too big, so they should not pass through the podocytes. So if you do see them, then there's some sort of problem. Okay, going back to the afferent arteriole, here's a good picture of showing the blood going in to the glomerulus. Okay, it gets filtered, and then some of that blood will come out the efferent. So afferent in, efferent out. Okay, the renal tubule is the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, also known as loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. Okay, all that is the renal tubule, okay, that you can see here. As blood is coming in, it is going to travel through the proximal convoluted tubule, proximal to what? The glomerulus, through the loop of Henle, then to the distal convoluted tubule, then into the collecting ducts, and eventually into the urinary bladder. All right, the proximal convoluted tubule is the longest of the tubes. Okay, then that tapers into that nephron loop, and there's the AKA, the loop of Henle. Okay, eventually the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting ducts. One of the points of these tubes here, so the loop of Henle, is an osmotic gradient, and the point of that is to help the body to conserve water. Okay, so our body does spend a lot of time trying to keep or hold on to water. Now, we do eliminate some fluid throughout the day, but overall, we do actually keep a lot of fluid. And if you go back to your endocrinology, anti-diuretic hormone, okay, so ADH, in the presence of ADH, you keep fluid. Okay, so anti-diuretic hormone does communicate with the kidney. The kidneys need a nerve innervation, right? So the brain and the spinal cord and all the peripheral nerves, that's part of our nervous system, which functions everything, right? The brain is responsible for functioning everything. So there has to be a neurological communication. So that's the renal plexus. The renal plexus does come off of the upper lumbars, which is important because some people will come in with what they think is low back pain, but really it could be a kidney problem. Okay, so sometimes kidney issues are misinterpreted for low back pain. Right, kidneys also produce renin, right? So that's part of the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism that we covered back in the endocrine system. So the kidney releases renin, and the liver releases angiotensinogen. In the presence of renin, angiotensinogen is converted into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted into angiotensin 2 because of ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, which comes from the lungs. And once you have angiotensin 2, that's a very powerful vasoconstrictor. Okay, so we have a nice open blood vessel, and then it becomes constricted. And when you have a constricted blood vessel, that's going to help you increase blood pressure. Okay, now that's the renin angiotensin part. Now the aldosterone part comes from the adrenal gland. And in the presence of aldosterone, you're going to keep sodium and therefore keep fluid. When you increase fluid, which means you're increasing volume, so when you increase blood volume, you automatically increase blood pressure. Fluid is heavy. And all this is hooked up to a pump. Okay, so that heart is going to pick up on the fact that there's more fluid. Water's heavy, so it's just simply going to increase its pressure. So both are designed to increase blood pressure, meaning the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism are designed to increase blood pressure. All right, so kidneys are going to be a part of that.